Hello and welcome to Play Me to Sleep. Tonight, we are going to travel to a small island on the edge of the known world, a place of rolling green hills, windswept coasts, and long, rain-soaked evenings. We are going to pull open a heavy wooden door, step inside, out of the cold, and explore one of Ireland's most beloved and enduring institutions. This is the story of the Irish pub. But this isn't simply a story about drinking. It is about far more than that. It is about community and survival, about music drifting through firelit rooms, about the keeping of stories and the forging of identity. It is about the one place in Irish life that has always remained open, regardless of what was happening outside its walls. Through invasions and famines, through centuries of poverty and emigration, through revolution and civil war, through the long grey years of economic hardship, and into the dazzling chaos of the modern world, the pub has stood. Tonight, we will trace its origins back thousands of years to a time before Christianity reached the island, when the people of Ireland were already gathering to drink together in ways that would be entirely recognizable today. We will meet the first recorded innkeepers in Irish law, explore the great medieval taverns of Dublin and Galway, follow the fortunes of the pub through conquest and religious prohibition, and discover how a small island's drinking culture became one of the most imitated and celebrated in the world. So, settle in. Let the sounds of the outside world fade, and let us raise a glass to a very long and very fascinating history. If you want to understand the Irish pub, you need to go back much further than the first tavern sign or the first barrel of imported ale. You need to go back to a time when Ireland was a land of tribal kingdoms, of druids and warriors, of cattle raids and epic poetry recited by firelight. You need to go back, in fact, to the Bruidean. The Bruidean was one of the most important institutions in early Irish society. The word is often translated simply as a hostel or a guest house, but that translation does not quite capture what it really was. It was a place of sacred hospitality, a house that was legally required to remain open at all times in every direction, with its doors never locked and its fire never allowed to go out. The keeper of a Bruidean, known as a briúg, held a position of remarkable social standing. In the complex hierarchical system of early Irish law, the briúg was ranked among the nobility, not because of his birth or his land, but because of his function. His entire purpose was to provide food, drink, and shelter to anyone who came to his door, without question and without payment. This was not charity. It was a sacred obligation woven into the legal and moral fabric of Irish society. To refuse hospitality was considered one of the gravest social failures a person could commit. The law texts of early medieval Ireland, known as the Brehon Laws, set out in extraordinary detail the duties of the briúg. He was required to maintain a never-ending supply of food and ale. He had to keep his cauldron permanently on the fire. He could never send anyone away hungry or thirsty. If he failed in these duties, he could lose his noble status entirely. Ale in this world was not an afterthought. It was central. The word for a great feast in Old Irish, cuam, is directly related to the word for ale. Drinking together was one of the primary ways in which Irish society marked important moments. It sealed agreements, honoured the dead, celebrated victories, and maintained the bonds between chieftains and their people. The great mythological feasts described in early Irish literature are remarkable for their detail. We read about heroes competing for the champion's portion of meat, about poets demanding extravagant payment in drink, about the flowing of vast quantities of mead and ale as the backdrop to every significant event. Mead, made from fermented honey, was the drink of kings. It was considered almost supernatural in its power. In Irish mythology, the great Hall of Tara, the ancient seat of the High Kings, was associated with a drink of sovereignty that the goddess of the land would offer to the rightful king. To drink from that cup was to be chosen. To be denied, it was to be rejected by the land itself. Ale, brewed from barley and flavoured with a variety of herbs before the widespread use of hops, was the more democratic drink, consumed across all levels of society, but still carrying enormous social and ceremonial weight. What is fascinating about this ancient Irish drinking culture is how recognisable it is. The emphasis on welcome, on never turning a stranger away, on the fire always burning and the cup always full, echoes through the centuries and finds its expression in the warmth that visitors to Irish pubs have noted ever since. The Bruidean was not just a functional place, it was a philosophical statement about what a community owed to the people passing through it. That philosophy never entirely went away. When Christianity arrived in Ireland in the 5th century, the island's relationship with drink did not disappear. It adapted. This is one of the remarkable features of Irish religious history. Unlike many parts of Europe where Christianity clashed violently with existing customs, in Ireland there was often a more fluid negotiation between the old ways and the new faith. The monasteries that began to spread across Ireland from the 6th century onwards became centres of learning, art, and, rather unexpectedly, brewing. Irish monks brewed ale. They brewed it extensively, and they regarded it as entirely compatible with their spiritual lives. Saint Brigid, one of the 3 patron saints of Ireland, is associated in legend with the miraculous transformation of bathwater into ale, and with the ability to multiply a single barrel to satisfy an entire congregation. Whether you take this literally or not, it tells you something important. Even the holiest figures in Irish popular religion were imagined as being comfortable with ale, as presiding over its abundance rather than its prohibition. The monasteries needed ale for their own communities, for the pilgrims and travellers who passed through, and for the labourers who worked their lands. Monastic brewing was a serious enterprise. Some of Ireland's great monastic sites, places like Clonmacnoise on the banks of the Shannon or Glendalough in the Wicklow Mountains, were busy crossroads of medieval life, drawing merchants, scholars, and pilgrims from across the known world. These visitors needed accommodation and sustenance. The monasteries provided it. Around the monastic settlements, and later around the growing towns that developed in Ireland during the early medieval period, more explicitly commercial drinking houses began to appear. The Brehon laws include detailed regulations about the selling of ale, setting out the acceptable price for a measure of drink, the standards of quality that must be maintained, and the responsibilities of the alewife, the bean liana, who was often the person managing the day-to-day running of a drinking establishment. The figure of the alewife is fascinating and often overlooked. For much of medieval European history, brewing and the selling of ale was predominantly women's work. Ireland was no exception. The bean liana operated her establishment under legal protection and legal obligation. She was responsible for the quality of her ale, the fairness of her measures, and the behavior of her customers. If someone was injured in a fight that broke out in her establishment, she could be held liable if she had not taken reasonable steps to prevent it. This was a woman running a business in a society that we often imagine as entirely male-dominated, and she was doing so with a degree of legal standing that would not look entirely out of place in a modern licensing framework. As towns grew, particularly the Norse settlements that would eventually become Dublin, Waterford, Limerick and Cork, the commercial drinking house became an increasingly important part of urban life. The Norse, who settled in Ireland from the 9th century onwards, brought their own strong drinking traditions with them, including a love of mead halls and communal feasting. The Irish and Norse cultures blended over time, and the Norse towns, with their markets and merchants and visitors from across the known world, created exactly the kind of cosmopolitan, transient population that needs permanent, professional places to eat and drink. In 1169, the Normans arrived in Ireland, and with them came a wave of changes that would reshape Irish society over the following centuries. The Normans were builders and administrators, people who liked to organize, regulate, and record things. They brought with them the European tradition of the formally licensed tavern, an establishment that existed within a framework of law and civic responsibility in a way that was more formal than anything that had existed before. The Norman towns, particularly Dublin, which became the centre of the new colonial administration, developed distinct areas of commercial activity. Taverns multiplied. They clustered along the quaysides where ships brought wine from France and Spain. They established themselves near the city gates where travellers arrived and departed. They appeared in the shadow of the great new churches and cathedrals that the Normans were building across the country. Wine became increasingly important during this period. The Anglo-Norman aristocracy had strong ties to France, and imported wine was a mark of status. The wine taverns of medieval Dublin served a wealthy, cosmopolitan clientele. But ale remained the drink of the majority, and the ale houses of the less fashionable streets served a very different kind of customer. This division between the respectable wine tavern and the rougher ale house would persist in various forms for centuries. The first formal licensing of drinking establishments in Ireland came during the medieval period under English administration. The Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, a piece of legislation that attempted to prevent Anglo-Norman settlers from adopting Irish customs and language, also touched on the regulation of taverns and the keeping of order within them. The English colonial project in Ireland had a complicated relationship with Irish drinking culture from the very beginning. On one hand, the authorities wanted to tax and regulate the trade. On the other, They were constantly suspicious of the alehouse as a place where Irish people gathered, where Gaelic was spoken, and where, potentially, resistance was discussed. This tension between the pub as a controlled commercial enterprise and the pub as an uncontrollable social space where the wrong kinds of conversations might take place would run through Irish history like a thread for the next several hundred years. Outside the English-controlled towns in the great Gaelic territories that still covered much of the country, the older traditions continued. The Gaelic chieftains maintained their great halls, their poets and musicians, their traditions of communal drinking and hospitality. The culture of the Bruadean, transformed and adapted over the centuries, persisted in the hospitality that Gaelic households extended to travellers. The distinction between the formal tavern of the colonial town and the informal gathering place of Gaelic Ireland would slowly dissolve as the centuries passed, producing something new. The 16th and 17th centuries were catastrophic for Ireland. The Tudor conquest, the plantation of Ulster and Munster, the Cromwellian Wars, and the Williamite campaign together transformed the island in ways that were devastating for the Gaelic Irish and Old English Catholic communities. Entire landowning classes were dispossessed. Ancient systems of social organization were dismantled. Population collapsed through war, famine, and plague. And yet, amid this destruction, something remarkable happened in the world of Irish drinking. Whiskey arrived, or rather, whiskey came of age. The distilling of a grain spirit in Ireland is mentioned in records as far back as the late 15th century, but it was during the 16th and 17th centuries that Uisci Beatha, the water of life, truly began to establish itself as the distinctively Irish drink. The word whiskey is simply an anglicization of Uisci Beatha, which is pronounced roughly as Ishka Baha in Irish. The English soldiers and administrators who encountered this fierce grain spirit among the Gaelic Irish found the name difficult to pronounce and gradually shortened and corrupted it to whiskey. Early Irish whiskey was a raw, potent thing, very different from the smooth, aged spirits we associate with the word today. It was distilled in small copper pot stills, often on farms or in monastic outbuildings, and consumed fresh without lengthy maturation. English authorities regarded it with deep suspicion. Various attempts were made to restrict or tax its production, partly for reasons of revenue, partly out of a genuine belief that the Irish were made more dangerous and ungovernable by their consumption of this powerful spirit. These attempts had limited effect. The practice of illegal distillation, what would later be called poitin making, took firm root during this period, establishing a tradition of semi-clandestine home distilling that persisted well into the 20th century. The alehouse of this period was often a rough and basic affair. Travellers' accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe Irish alehouses with varying degrees of horror and fascination. The English traveller Fynes Morrison, who visited Ireland in the 1590s, described establishments where travellers slept on rushes on the floor alongside the animals, where the drink was strong and the conversation incomprehensible to anyone who did not speak Irish. He was not entirely impressed, but his descriptions also convey, despite himself, a certain vitality. a sense of these places as genuinely alive with community and conversation. As the 17th century progressed and the effects of plantation and conquest began to shape the new social landscape of Ireland, the public house began to evolve into something more recognizable. The new Protestant landlord class needed places to conduct business. The growing market towns that were established under the plantation system needed commercial infrastructure. The inn, offering food, drink, and accommodation to travelers on horseback, became an important institution along the new road networks that were being built across the country. These inns were the ancestors of today's pub in the most direct sense. They were licensed premises subject to regulation, paying taxes, providing a defined set of services to a paying public. They were also, crucially, social centers. In a country with few other public gathering spaces, the inn was where news was exchanged, where business was transacted, where the social life of a town or village had its most animated expression. If there is one era in Irish history that feels like the golden age of the traditional inn, it is the 18th century. This was a period of extraordinary contrast. It was a time of great wealth for the Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy class and of grinding poverty for the Catholic majority. It was a time of magnificent Georgian architecture in Dublin and Cork and Limerick, and of mud-walled cabins in the countryside. It was also a time when the culture of the inn and the tavern and the alehouse reached new levels of sophistication and new depths of sociability. Dublin in the 18th century was the second city of the British Empire. It had a parliament, a legal system, a university, an aristocracy, and all the cultural institutions that went with them. It also had taverns and coffee houses and clubs and drinking establishments of every kind. The great coffee houses of Dame Street and College Green were where the intellectual and political life of the Protestant ascendancy played out. Men like Jonathan Swift, the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral and the most savage satirist in the English language, were regulars in these establishments. The playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who would later conquer London's theatre world, grew up in Dublin's drinking culture. The philosopher George Berkeley was known to drink with friends in the taverns near Trinity College. But it was not only the wealthy who had their gathering places. The city's growing working class had its own distinct drinking culture, centered on the gin shops and whiskey houses that proliferated in the Liberties and the Coombe and the other working-class districts that surrounded the grand Georgian squares. These were very different establishments from the gentlemen's taverns of the wealthy neighborhoods. They were smaller, louder, more chaotic. They were also more genuinely communal in the old Irish sense, places where music and story and argument and gossip mixed freely with the drinking. In the countryside, the 18th century was the great era of the coaching inn. The expanding road network, driven by the Turnpike Acts that began to be applied to Ireland in this period, created a network of routes along which coaches and horses and their passengers moved. Every town and many large villages on these routes had their coaching inn, a place that might offer stabling for horses, beds for travellers, hot food, and a well-stocked bar. These establishments were often the most substantial buildings in their towns, built to impress. Some of them are still operating today, their Georgian facades little changed, their interiors updated, but their basic character intact. The rural whiskey shop was a rather different creature. These were often simple thatched buildings, sometimes little more than a room in a farmhouse, where illegal or semi-legal poitín was sold alongside whatever official spirits and ales were available. They served the agricultural labourers and small farmers who formed the bulk of the rural population. They were gathering places for news and gossip and the settlement of local disputes. They were where seasonal workers were hired, where debts were acknowledged, where the whole complex social fabric of rural Irish life had one of its primary expressions. Music was central to all of this. Ireland had one of the richest traditions of folk music in Europe, and the 18th century was in many ways its greatest flowering. The Willian pipes developed in their distinctive Irish form during this period. The fiddle, the tin whistle, the bodhrán. These instruments found their natural home in the smoky, crowded atmosphere of the drinking house. Sessions, the informal gatherings of musicians that remain a defining feature of Irish pub culture today, had their origins in these 18th century gatherings. Music was not performed at a distance for a passive audience. It was played by people who might also be drinking and talking and listening in a communal atmosphere where the boundary between performer and audience was blurred. In 1845, a blight hit Ireland's potato crop. In the years that followed, approximately 1 million people died of starvation and disease, and another million emigrated. By 1851, the population of Ireland had fallen by around 25%. The Great Famine was the defining catastrophe of modern Irish history, and it cast a shadow over everything that followed, including the culture of the pub. The immediate effect of the famine on Irish drinking establishments was mixed. In the worst affected areas, the poorest rural communities were simply destroyed. The tiny whiskey shops and ale houses that had served agricultural labourers disappeared along with their customers. Landlords who had supported their tenants and local economies through patronage of local businesses found themselves overwhelmed or bankrupt. Entire communities that had sustained particular drinking houses for generations simply ceased to exist. And yet, in the towns, and especially in the ports, the pub continued and even grew. The massive movement of population toward the coast, as people sought passage to America or England, brought tens of thousands through the streets of Dublin, Cork, and Queenstown, the present-day Cove, which was the main emigration port. Many of these people spent their last nights in Ireland in its drinking establishments, in gatherings that combined grief and relief and a kind of desperate celebration. The American Wake, as these farewell gatherings were known, often took place in or around the pub. The temperance movement, which had grown enormously in Ireland in the years before the famine under the influence of the Capuchin friar Father Theobald Matthew, saw a complicated shift in its fortunes during and after the catastrophe. Father Matthew had persuaded enormous numbers of Irish people to take a pledge of total abstinence from alcohol during the late 1830s and early 1840s. His rallies attracted hundreds of thousands of people. At one point, it was estimated that nearly half the adult population of Ireland had taken the pledge. This was a genuinely extraordinary social movement, driven partly by genuine concern about the effects of heavy drinking on impoverished communities, and partly by the influence of the Catholic Church, which was becoming an increasingly powerful force in Irish life. The famine disrupted Father Matthew's movement, and in its aftermath, the temperance pledge faded for many of those who had taken it. But the Church's ambivalence about, and sometimes outright hostility toward, the pub would remain a feature of Irish life for the next century. Parish priests denounced the drinking house from the pulpit. Pioneer total abstinence associations organized local abstinence pledges. The pioneer badge, a small red and gold pin worn on the lapel, became a common sight throughout the 20th century as a mark of teetotalism and Catholic devotion combined into a single visible statement. This gave Irish pub culture a peculiar double character that it retained for generations. On one hand, the pub was deeply woven into the fabric of Irish community life, a place of genuine importance and warmth. On the other, it existed under a cloud of moral suspicion, associated in the minds of many with poverty, domestic violence, wasted wages, and a general failure of character. These two views of the pub, one celebratory and one condemnatory, coexisted in uncomfortable tension throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The second half of the 19th century brought significant changes to the legal and physical landscape of the Irish pub. A series of licensing acts, particularly the Licensing Acts of the 1870s and beyond, attempted to bring greater regulation and control to the trade in alcohol. These acts set out in detail who could sell alcohol, on what premises, at what times, and under what conditions. The licensing system that emerged from this period is, in its essential structure, still the basis of Irish licensing law today. One of the most fascinating and distinctly Irish products of this regulatory environment was the spirit grocery. This was a hybrid establishment, part grocery shop and part licensed premises, that became one of the defining features of Irish provincial life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The logic was straightforward. In a country where many communities were small and where the church frowned upon dedicated drinking establishments, combining a shop with a bar allowed the pub to exist in a slightly more respectable guise. You were not going to the pub. You were going to the shop. The fact that there was a bar at the back, or that the shop counter itself doubled as a serving area for spirits, was almost incidental. The spirit grocery was also a practical response to economic reality. In small rural communities, a single family could not always make a living from drink alone. By combining the licensed trade with the selling of groceries, hardware, seeds, or animal feed, a family could maintain a viable business through the fluctuations of agricultural seasons and local economic conditions. The shop pub became so common that it is still encountered in rural Ireland today, though the grocery element has often dwindled to a few dusty shelves in the corner. The physical design of the Victorian pub also began to take on its characteristic form during this period. The snug, a small enclosed space partitioned off from the main bar, became a defining feature of Irish pub architecture. Its origins were partly practical, providing shelter from drafts in buildings that were often far from weatherproof. But it also served an important social function. Women, who were generally not considered respectable if they entered the main bar of a pub, could use the snug for a relatively private drink. Priests and other respectable figures who wanted a discreet drink without being seen could occupy a snug. Local businessmen could conduct private conversations. The snug democratized the pub's social function by creating a space within it that was slightly separate from the sometimes rowdy atmosphere of the main bar. The mahogany bar counter, the etched glass partitions, the ornate mirrors carrying advertisements for whiskey and porter, the gas lamps later replaced by electric ones. All of these elements came together in the Victorian era to create the aesthetic that many people associate with the Irish pub today. It was an aesthetic borrowed partly from English gin palaces, transformed and made distinctly Irish by the particular social and architectural context in which it developed. To understand what the Irish pub became in the 20th century, you cannot ignore the writers. Dublin, perhaps uniquely among European cities, produced a tradition of literary pub culture so rich and so well documented that it has become an almost mythological presence in the city's self-image. The pubs of Dublin were not merely places where writers drank. They were places where the conversations that shaped Irish literature took place, where rivalries were formed and dissolved, where the raw material of some of the greatest writing in the English language was gathered over pints of stout and glasses of whiskey. James Joyce, who left Ireland in 1904 but never mentally departed from its pubs and streets and personalities, made the pubs central to the great interior landscape of his work. The episode of Ulysses, set in Barney Kiernan's pub, a fictional version of a real Dublin establishment, is one of the most celebrated pieces of pub writing in world literature. Joyce captures with extraordinary precision the particular atmosphere of a certain kind of Dublin pub. The heavy-handed nationalism, the casual prejudice, the brilliant comic observation, the sudden sharp turns of conversation that could move from the sublime to the ridiculous in a single breath. Brendan Behan was a different kind of literary figure, and his relationship with the pub was different too. Where Joyce observed the pub from a certain ironic distance, Behan inhabited it completely. Born in Dublin in 1923, he grew up in a family deeply embedded in Republican politics and in Dublin working-class culture, both of which had the pub at their centre. Behan was a brilliant playwright, the author of The Quare, Fellow, and The Hostage. But he was also, and sometimes more famously, a brilliant talker and a spectacular drunk. His performances in Dublin pubs, the stories he told, the songs he sang, the fights he picked, and the reconciliations he engineered became part of the city's folklore almost before his early death in 1964. Patrick Kavanagh, the poet from County Monaghan who arrived in Dublin in the 1930s and spent decades navigating its literary scene, had a more complicated relationship with pub culture. He was a regular in McDade's on Harry Street and in Mulligan's of Poolbeg Street, two of the pubs most associated with Dublin's literary bohemia. His long poem, The Great Hunger, and his later lyrics contain some of the most searching examinations of rural Irish life ever written, and the pub often appears in them as a place of both warmth and failed connection, of community that is always slightly out of reach. These literary associations gave certain Dublin pubs a kind of cultural weight that they carry to this day. Mulligan's, which claims to have been established in 1782 and has barely changed its interior in a century, still serves pints of Guinness to customers who are in part drinking in the atmosphere of all the writers and talkers who drank there before them. The Palace Bar on Fleet Street, Neary's on Chatham Street, Toner's on Baggot Street. These places are pilgrimage sites as much as drinking establishments, places where the past is almost palpable, where you feel that the next person to sit beside you at the bar might be about to say something worth remembering. No account of the Irish pub can go very far without encountering Guinness, the black stout brewed at the St. James's Gate. Brewery in Dublin is so entwined with the identity of the Irish pub that it is almost impossible to speak of one without the other. And yet the story of how Guinness came to occupy this position is not as simple or as inevitable as it might seem. Arthur Guinness signed his famous 9,000-year lease on the St. James's Gate site in 1759. He was, at that point, one of many brewers in Ireland. Dublin alone had dozens of commercial breweries. The island was awash with ale, porter and stout from a variety of producers. What made Guinness different, and what drove its eventual dominance, was a combination of exceptional business sense, significant investment in quality and scale, and fortunate timing. The 19th century was the great age of porter and stout. These dark, heavily roasted malt beers had originated in London in the early 18th century, initially brewed for the porters of the city's markets, but had spread rapidly across Britain and Ireland. Guinness had been brewing a version of porter since the 1770s, and by the early 19th century it had become the brewery's primary product. The quality and consistency of Guinness's output, combined with its vast scale and its ability to distribute across Ireland and later to Britain and beyond, gradually squeezed out smaller competitors. By the late 19th century, Guinness was the largest brewery in the world. By the early 20th century, its stout had become so dominant in the Irish market that for many drinkers, the word Guinness was simply synonymous with the word stout. Ordering a pint in an Irish pub for much of the 20th century meant ordering a pint of Guinness. The ritual of the pour, the careful tilting of the glass, the two-stage process of filling and settling and topping off, the wait of the legendary 2 minutes. All of this became a ceremony that was as much about identity and tradition as it was about the actual business of getting a drink. The relationship between Guinness and the Irish pub was mutually reinforcing in very direct ways. Guinness supplied equipment to publicans, maintained their dispense systems, provided advertising and promotional support. The famous Guinness advertisements, many of them produced by the brilliant artist John Gilroy in the 1930s and 1940s, with their depictions of toucans and zoo animals and the simple command to "Guinness is good for you," became part of the visual wallpaper of Irish life. They were everywhere, on pub walls, on mirrors, on enamelled metal signs outside every licensed premises in the country. The mythology of the perfect pint of Guinness, the ideal that every barman and every pub aspired to but few could quite achieve, became one of the central aesthetic standards of Irish pub culture. Arguments about which pub poured the best pint were entirely serious arguments, as carefully considered as any debate about wine or gastronomy. The position of the barrel, the cleanliness of the lines, the temperature of the cellar, the technique of the pour. All of these were subjects of genuine expertise and genuine passion. For much of the 20th century, the Irish pub occupied a social position that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. In a country with limited leisure infrastructure, strict censorship of films and publications, a powerful church that frowned upon many forms of entertainment, and widespread poverty that made most commercial leisure unaffordable, the pub was often the only game in town. Literally, the Licensed Premises Acts of the Irish Free State and later the Republic attempted to regulate this central social institution in ways that sometimes reached extraordinary levels of detail. The concept of the bona fide traveller, a legal exception that allowed people who had travelled more than 3 miles from their home to be served outside of normal licensing hours, gave rise to entire traditions of Sunday afternoon drives to pubs, just far enough from home to qualify. The closing time laws, which mandated strict hours for the closing of licensed premises, produced the phenomenon of the lock-in, where the doors were bolted after official closing time, and a select group of regulars continued drinking in a theoretical privacy. The lock-in was illegal. It was also, at various times and in various parts of the country, so universal as to be almost an official custom. The country pub in particular occupied a position of extraordinary social centrality. In rural Ireland, where the parish church and the Gaelic Athletic Association Club were the other 2 main pillars of community life, the pub was the third member of an informal trinity. Local elections were discussed and decided in pubs. Marriages were negotiated in them. The death notices were read there because the pub was often where older men spent their days and where news, including the most important news, was first disseminated. The ritual of the communal drink after a funeral, the distribution of whiskey or porter to the mourners who had gathered in the graveyard, was often the beginning of a session that moved to the nearest pub and lasted well into the evening. The pub game of the 20th century was either cards or darts, depending on where in the country you were. In the West and South, a card game called 25 was played with a seriousness and a competitive intensity that made it feel like a blood sport. In the cities and the East, darts was the equivalent. These games were not diversions from the serious business of the pub. They were part of its social fabric, ways of organizing the time and the company, of creating rivalry and alliance, and the small dramas that give community life its texture. Television arrived in Ireland in 1961, and its impact on the pub was initially feared to be catastrophic. Why would men leave their homes on a winter evening to walk through the rain to the pub when they could watch television in warmth and comfort? The fear proved largely unfounded. The television in the pub, rather than replacing the pub with the home, actually drew people out of their homes and into the pub to watch together. Major sporting events, international football and rugby matches, the All-Ireland finals in hurling and Gaelic football, became occasions for communal pub watching that created some of the most memorable collective experiences in Irish life. The tradition of music in the Irish pub is so deeply rooted that it is easy to take it for granted. But the Irish session, as we know it today, a gathering of musicians who play together informally in a pub, sharing tunes from the living tradition of Irish folk music, is actually a relatively recent formalization of a practice that had been evolving for centuries. The formal trad session, in its modern recognizable form, emerged largely in Dublin in the 1960s, in pubs like O'Donoghue's on Merrion Row, which became a crucible for the folk revival that was transforming Irish music at that time. O'Donoghue's was where the Dubliners, one of the defining acts of the Irish folk revival, had their origins. Ronnie Drew and Barney McKenna and Luke Kelly and Ciaran Bork gathered there in the early 1960s, playing and singing and arguing and developing the sound that would take Irish folk music to the world. But to describe the session as a product of the folk revival is to miss something important. The musicians who gathered in O'Donoghue's and in the many other Dublin pubs that became centres of folk music were drawing on a living tradition that had never died in the countryside. The sessions in rural pubs, less celebrated but no less vital, had continued through all the upheavals of the 20th century. The travelling musicians who moved between fairs and markets and seasonal celebrations, the local players who gathered on Sunday afternoons to play the tunes they had learned from their parents and grandparents, these were the keepers of the tradition that the folk revival would rediscover and broadcast to the world. The instruments of the Irish session have their own histories. The Willian pipes, the most complex and distinctive of Irish instruments, require a player to be seated, with the bag inflated by a bellows, worked by the elbow, the chanter on the knee, and a range of regulators also controlled by the hands. They are not outdoor instruments. They are indoor instruments, instruments of the intimate gathering, perfectly suited to the atmosphere of a low-ceilinged pub with a fire burning in the corner. The fiddle and the tin whistle are more portable, and their music carries the particular quality of Irish traditional tunes, the combination of melancholy and exuberance that seems to express something essential about the national character. The bodhran, the frame drum that has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Irish music, has a complicated and disputed history. Some scholars argue that it is an ancient instrument with roots in pre-Christian ritual. Others suggest it was essentially invented or reinvented by the folk revival of the 1960s, popularized largely by the musician Seán Ó Riada. Whatever its true origins, the bodhran found its natural home in the pub session, providing the rhythmic foundation over which the melody instruments weaved their intricate patterns. Today, the trad session in the Irish pub is one of the most potent images of Irish cultural identity in the world. Millions of tourists travel to Ireland every year specifically to sit in a pub and listen to live traditional music. The session has become both a genuine living practice and a carefully managed tourist experience, and navigating the distinction between the two is one of the more interesting challenges of modern Irish pub culture. In the 1990s, Ireland was transformed by an economic miracle. After decades of stagnation and emigration, the Irish economy began to grow at rates that seemed almost impossible. Foreign investment poured in, particularly from American technology companies attracted by low corporate taxes and an educated English-speaking workforce. Employment rose, wages rose, property prices rose, and the confidence of the Irish people, long tempered by a history of poverty and disappointment, underwent a remarkable shift. The pub boomed with everything else. The traditional local pub, which had survived on the margins of economic viability for much of the 20th century, suddenly found itself with customers who had money to spend. Investment flooded into the trade. Old pubs were refurbished, some of them losing their authentic character in the process to a kind of theme pub aesthetic. New pubs were built on an industrial scale in the rapidly expanding suburbs of Dublin and Cork and Galway. The nightclub culture that spread through Ireland in the 1990s changed the relationship between young people and the pub. A generation that had grown up in a country where the pub was the center of all social life now had options that their parents had never had. Late-night venues, DJ culture, foreign holidays, and eventually the internet created alternatives to the pub that slowly began to erode the absolute social centrality it had enjoyed for centuries. This was also the era in which the Irish theme pub was exported to the world. The phenomenon of the Irish pub abroad, with its dark wood and etched glass and carefully sourced Guinness taps and perhaps a photograph of James Joyce on the wall, became a global industry. Irish pub design companies emerged to create authentic-seeming Irish drinking environments in cities from New York to Tokyo to Sydney. There are now, at any given time, something in the region of 7,000 Irish-themed pubs outside Ireland, spread across more than 50 countries. This is an extraordinary cultural reach for a small island nation. Whether these international Irish pubs represent genuine cultural export or a kind of commodified nostalgia is a question that divides opinion. The Irish diaspora, enormous after 2 centuries of emigration, found in these establishments a connection to home, however artificial the atmosphere. The non-Irish customers who filled them found something they wanted, an experience of conviviality and warmth and informal music that they associated with Irishness. The pub became, in this international context, not just a drinking establishment, but a brand, one of the most successful cultural brands that a small country has ever produced. On the 29th of March 2004, Ireland became the first country in the world to introduce a comprehensive ban on smoking in workplaces, including pubs. The decision was greeted with widespread skepticism. This was Ireland, after all, a country in which the pub was almost a sacred institution and in which any interference with its customs was regarded as close to sacrilege. The publicans' organizations predicted disaster. Industry commentators predicted mass pub closures. A generation of Irish drinkers could not quite imagine sitting in a pub without the haze of cigarette smoke that had been as much a part of the atmosphere as the music or the banter. What actually happened was remarkable. The smoking ban worked. Not only did it work so well that within months of its introduction, countries across Europe and around the world were looking at the Irish model and beginning to introduce their own versions. The feared collapse of the pub trade did not materialize, at least not immediately, and not for the reasons predicted. Instead, a new culture of outdoor drinking emerged as smokers congregated on pavements and in hastily constructed beer gardens. The Irish pub, resourceful as ever, adapted. The beer garden, previously a marginal feature of Irish pub design associated mainly with summer and fine weather, became a year-round necessity. Pubs invested in outdoor heating, in awnings and canopies, in wooden decking and comfortable outdoor furniture. The outdoor drinking area became, paradoxically, one of the most socially animated spaces in the pub, a place where smokers and non-smokers mingled in a way that had not quite happened indoors. The designated smoking area outside the pub became a social institution in its own right, a place where conversations happened and connections were made. More broadly, the smoking ban marked a turning point in the relationship between the Irish pub and its changing society. Ireland was modernizing rapidly in the early 2000s, and the pub was modernizing with it. Attitudes to drinking itself were changing, driven by greater health awareness, changing tastes among younger generations, and the gradual relaxation of the social pressure to drink that had been a feature of Irish pub culture for generations. The expectation that everyone in a group would drink alcohol and drink at the same pace began to soften. Designated drivers, non-alcoholic options, and a greater comfort with simply having one drink or two rather than 5 or 6 began to change the social dynamics of a night out. In the early 21st century, a new force began to reshape the Irish drinks industry: craft beer. Ireland had been dominated by the products of a small number of large breweries for generations. Guinness and Heineken, which owns the Murphy's and Beamish brands among others, controlled the vast majority of the market. Then, driven by a movement that had already transformed the beer cultures of the United States and parts of Europe, small independent breweries began to appear across Ireland. The first wave of Irish craft breweries, which began in the 2000s and accelerated dramatically in the 2010s, initially struggled to find their place. The major breweries had long-established relationships with the country's publicans, and getting craft beers onto draft taps was difficult. But gradually, as consumer interest grew and as the quality of Irish craft brewing improved, the landscape began to change. By the mid-2000s, Ireland had dozens of craft breweries producing everything from pale ales and IPAs to sours, porters, and experimental styles that would have been unimaginable to an Irish drinker of an earlier generation. The craft beer revolution had a complex relationship with the traditional pub. On one hand, it brought new energy and new customers into the trade. The craft beer bar, with its range of rotating taps, its knowledgeable bar staff, and its culture of beer appreciation, attracted a younger, more adventurous audience. On the other hand, it created a different kind of pub culture, one that was less about the ritual and the community and the long afternoon of conversation and more about the product itself, about exploring flavors and styles and the individual character of different beers. Irish whiskey underwent a parallel revolution. After decades of contraction, in which the number of working Irish distilleries had shrunk from dozens in the 19th century to just a handful in the late 20th, the whiskey industry began an extraordinary revival. New distilleries opened across the country, from urban micro-distilleries in Dublin to farm distilleries in Kerry and Connemara. Irish whiskey became one of the fastest-growing spirits categories in the world. Its combination of smoothness, sweetness, and approachability finding audiences on every continent. This whiskey renaissance brought new pride and new visitors to Ireland. Whiskey tourism, following the routes of the great distilleries, became a significant subsector of the Irish tourism industry. And the pub, as always, was where the whiskey was ultimately consumed, where the stories about its making were told, where its qualities were debated with the seriousness that the Irish have always brought to matters of drink. In March 2020, the Government of Ireland ordered the closure of all pubs in the country as part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was the first time in Irish history that pubs had been universally closed, a distinction that gives some sense of just how extraordinary the pandemic was. The closures lasted, with brief interruptions, for much of the following 18 months. It was the longest and most comprehensive disruption to Irish pub culture in recorded history. The effect on the industry was devastating. Many pubs, particularly those in city centres that depended heavily on tourist trade or on the evening economy of workers passing through, never reopened. The publicans' organisations estimated that hundreds of Irish pubs closed permanently as a result of the pandemic. These were not just businesses. They were often family enterprises that had been operating for generations, institutions as much as commercial premises, embedded in their communities in ways that meant their loss was felt as something close to a bereavement. When pubs did reopen, they opened into a changed world. The boom years of the Celtic Tiger were a distant memory. Inflation was rising. The cost of energy was reaching extraordinary levels. The cost of a pint, which had been one of the great bargains of Irish social life compared to many European countries, rose sharply and continued to rise. For the first time in decades, there was a serious public conversation about whether the Irish pub as a social institution was sustainable. And yet the pubs filled again when they opened. People who had spent 18 months sitting at home, talking to their friends through screens, missing the particular quality of being physically present with other people, in a familiar room with a drink in their hand, came back. They came back in large numbers and with an evident relief that suggested once again that the pub was meeting a need that nothing else quite met. The post-pandemic pub is changing in some ways. There is more food, more coffee, more afternoon trade that does not revolve around alcohol. The gastropub, which had been growing in Ireland since the 1990s, became more important as pubs looked for additional revenue streams. The concept of the pub as purely a drinking establishment was giving way in some parts of the market to the idea of the pub as a general community gathering place that happened to have a license. Walk into an Irish pub on a winter evening and pay attention, not to the decor or the prices or the particular brand of stout on tap, but to the atmosphere, to the specific quality of the social air in the room. There is something there that is very difficult to describe, but very easy to recognize. It is a particular combination of ease and engagement, of the permission to speak or to be silent, of the sense that time moves differently inside these walls than it does outside. This quality, which the Irish sometimes call crack, a word borrowed from the English and Scottish dialect word crack, but transformed in the Irish context into something richer and more specific, is the essential product of the Irish pub. It is not something that can be manufactured or designed, though many have tried. It is generated by the accumulation of human presence over time, by the rituals and conventions that have developed over centuries of use, by the particular way in which the Irish pub manages the transition from stranger to acquaintance to something approaching friendship. The Irish pub is one of the few remaining public spaces in modern life where it is considered entirely normal to talk to someone you do not know. The bar counter is a leveler. You can sit beside a farmer and a solicitor and a teacher and a musician and find that the conversation flows between them without the self-consciousness that might characterize a similar mixing in almost any other context. This democratic quality, this sense that the pub belongs equally to everyone who enters it, is one of its most ancient and most enduring features. It goes back, in a direct line, to the Druidian and its obligation of unconditional welcome. There are approximately 7,000 pubs in Ireland today. That is one pub for every 700 people, a ratio that is high by any international standard. The number has been declining for decades, and the pace of decline has accelerated since the pandemic. The closure of rural pubs in particular is a social crisis as well as an economic one. When a village pub closes, the village loses its last public gathering space, its last neutral ground, its last place where community life has a physical expression. The isolation of rural Ireland, already a serious problem, deepens. And yet, the pub endures. It endures because it meets needs that are genuinely human and genuinely difficult to meet in other ways. The need for community, for the kind of belonging that comes not from formal membership, but from simple, regular presence in a familiar place. The need for conversation, for the stimulation of other minds, for the testing of your own ideas against the ideas of others. The need for music, for the particular kind of joy that comes from hearing live music in a small room where the musicians are close enough to touch. The need, perhaps most of all, for a place that is yours without being your property, a common ground that belongs to everyone and to no one. We began this story in the Druidian, in a world of tribal kingdoms and sacred hospitality, of fires that were never allowed to go out and doors that were never allowed to be locked. We end it in the 21st century, in a world of craft beer menus and outdoor heating units and card machines and the persistent, difficult question of what the pub can be in a changing society. What connects these two worlds across more than 1,000 years of history is something that has proved remarkably resistant to time and change. The idea that people need to gather, that they need a place to do so, that the best of those places offer warmth and welcome, and the particular kind of freedom that comes from being in a public space that has been, over long time, shaped by human use into something comfortable and familiar. The history of the Irish pub is, in the end, a history of Irish society itself, its rises and falls, Its great moments of communal vitality and its long periods of quiet endurance mirror the larger story of the island and its people. Through conquest and famine, through religious prohibition and economic catastrophe, through the long years of emigration and the sudden boom of the Celtic tiger, the pub has been there. Changed, certainly. Reduced in number, and in some ways in influence. But present. The writers who drank in its booths and argued at its bars left some of the greatest literature in the English language. The musicians who played in its back rooms kept a living tradition alive through decades when nothing else might have sustained it. The ordinary men and women who made it their regular place of gathering, who sat in its snugs and argued at its counters and mourned their dead and celebrated their children and fell in love and fell out of love within its walls, gave it the one thing that no design company or marketing campaign can manufacture: a genuine human soul. That soul is still there. If you listen carefully, past the background music and the noise of the television in the corner and the particular sound of a busy bar at the height of an evening, you can hear something older, the echo of many voices across many centuries, talking and singing and arguing and laughing in the way that people always have and always will when they are gathered together in a warm room with a drink in their hand and the rain falling soft outside the door. Thank you for listening. Good night and sleep well.